Every year it seems that a piece of history is erased from the American landscape. Progress and the elements do their damnedest to erase buildings which had a role in significant events, both good and bad. Time may heal all wounds, they say, but it also inflicts new ones, as it devours like a bulldozer. I would be reminded of this disappointing truth when visiting one historical location within an hour of landing at the Kansas City airport. The site is just a short drive away, less than 2 miles, and located in a very unlikely place, a business park that looked as if there was no possible link to America's most infamous criminal couple. My son had just picked me up and we drove to the parking lot of the Ambassador office building. At least someone saw fit to place a historical marker remembering what happened on the other side of the parking lot. But history is often not a priority of the daily business world, and I wondered how many bothered to pause from the hustle and bustle to stop and take in the fascinating history represented there. Welcome to another episode of History Hunters. If I look tired, it's because I just took a flight from California to Kansas City this morning. It's a 3-hour flight. I had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning California time, so I'm pretty bushed. So I'm here in Kansas City to visit my son and his wife and my grandkids. But our first stop here is going to be at this marker, which marks the location where Bonnie and Clyde had a shootout on July 20th, 1933. Now, nobody got killed on that one. There was a member of their gang that got seriously wounded. It was Buck Barrows, who was the brother of Clyde Barrow. He's the Clyde of Bonnie and Clyde. Just to let you know, a round entered the temple of Buck and exited out his forehead. But yet he lived. I mean, he lived until days later. He died in an Iowa hospital after he was apprehended. This plaque here was erected in 2011, I believe, by the Platte County Historical Society. And there's a picture of the Red Crown Tavern right there. It shows the gas pumps out in front. There's a cafe there. And if you look right here, those are the cabins that Clyde Barrows decided to duck into for the night. But it gives a little history here. Let's read this sign. Former site of the Red Crown Tavern and Tourist Cabin. In 1931, Emmett Green built Red Crown Tavern and Tourist Cabin west of here. On July 19th, 1933, Platte County Sheriff Holt Coffey led a coalition of lawmen from the Platte County Sheriff's Office, the Missouri Highway Patrol, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office in an attempt to capture fugitives. Bonnie Parker, Clyde Barrow, Buck Barrow, Blanche Barrow, and W.D. Jones had rented the 2 cabins. 13 lawmen surrounded them, but the gang shot their way out and escaped. Buck Barrows was mortally wounded, and Blanche's eyes were injured. Sheriff Coffey and 2 locals were also wounded. This is not the actual location for the Red Crown Tavern. It's a little ways over that way, and we're going to walk over there and see what we can find out about it. Here's my family over here. This is my granddaughter, Evelyn.
Hi.
It is super windy here. This lake, which I'm assuming is a man-made lake, may be a part of a drainage basin for this facility. Pretty sure it wasn't here at the time. And I'm going to make my way over here to the actual site where the Red Crown was. How did they end up here? Well, they were involved in some horrible crimes from 1931 to about 1934. This band terrorized the Midwest by robbing gas stations, banks, even rural funeral homes of any money they could. And there was a gun battle that happened over here. We're going to have to use some imagination because here comes my granddaughter and my grandson. We're going to have to use some imagination on this because the buildings aren't here anymore. Now, some people have assumed that the Red Crown was actually where that marker was. That's not the case. They often will put markers in close proximity to where locations were because this site has been obliterated pretty much. A couple years ago, Ready for History was out here, and I noted that he looked at this site. He found some bricks buried in the ground that were left over from the Red Crown Tavern. So Bonnie and Clyde really didn't like staying in places that were heavily populated because their picture had been published in newspapers and an account of how they were traveling and how many people were in their party. So they didn't really like to come to areas like this. But there was a problem. It was on June 10th when Clyde crashed their car outside of Wellington, Texas. The car crashed into a ravine because he was going too fast, didn't see that the road had been washed out. The car crashed to the battery, spilled acid all over Bonnie's leg and hip, actually burned her skin down to the bone, so she was in serious pain. They needed a place to duck into for a while and nurse her wounds a little bit, and they came across a gas station up here called Slim's Castle. It was in this location. Right across the street was an auto court. The auto court was a place where they could rent a room for a night. So members of the gang were, of course, Bonnie and Clyde. Then there was Clyde's brother, Buck, and his wife, Blanche, and there was a Debbie D. Jones. There were 5 in the party. The suspicions of the people who were behind the counter were high because the lady who came in had slinky riding pants. It was Blanche. The guys were really taking a look at her. She kind of didn't blend in with what was around here in Platte County. And so they were already suspicious. When they rented the room, they said that there were 3 in the party. So they go over to this auto court. There's 2 rooms. It's a brick building. There's 2 garages attached to the apartments, basically, is what it was. It was an auto court. And they backed their car into the garage, which was kind of what gangsters did to get quick getaways. And then later, the proprietor of the hotel, his suspicions were heightened even more when she just went over to the cafe and she ordered dinners for 5 people and 5 beers. Well, only 3 were supposed to be in the party. She didn't want them to know that there were 5 in the party because everybody knew there were 5 members of the gang. So just before they got here in Fort Dodge on July 18th, they had staged a crime spree. They needed money. They were desperate. They robbed a gas station, and I understand that they even robbed the customers of their money. And they broke into gumball machines and they scooped out all the change. They had about $150, and they drove the 250 miles here, Kansas City. I'm pretty much in the location where the Red Tavern was. Now, I'm pretty sure that they moved a lot of the land around here when they made the highway, and it looks like there's been a lot of vegetation here that's grown up, but we're going to try to find some things here. Hopefully we'll have some luck. I don't even know if this was the actual ground or if this has been piled up by bulldozers since that time. But yeah, this would have been the approximate area where all the bad stuff happened. Buck didn't think it was going to be a very good idea to come here to Kansas City because on June 17th was the Kansas City massacre. He knew that the law enforcement would be flooding this area. But Clyde knew that Bonnie needed a place to recuperate, and they pulled into the gas station that was here called Slim's Castle. Clyde spied rooms across the street, and he was wary from the road, and he announced, "This is where we stay the rest of the night, even if we all get killed before the morning." Before they drove over to the establishment, Buck, Barrows, and Jones covered up with a blanket, not because they could get rooms cheaper, because they didn't want anyone to know that 5 were in the party, because that wouldn't line up with what law enforcement issued about the gang. 3 men and 2 women. Now, what they also didn't know is that law enforcement liked to hang out here back then. They didn't have 2-way radio, so they would often meet up at the cafe that was here, share information about different things going on. Now, before the gang went to sleep that night, Clyde taped newspapers to the inside of the windows, and he was seen occasionally peeking out. The next morning, Blanche shows up at the cafe again, buying 5 meals for 3 people. And she sensed that the people in the cafe were onto her, and they were. Platte County Sheriff Holt Coffey was in there, sizing her up. She went back to the room and told Clyde. Clyde said, "Go back and pay for another night, kind of see how they're acting." And Blanche got a bad vibe when she did that, and as she handed him more coinage, she sensed that he was onto her. Clyde wasn't too worried about it, though. Said, "It was just your imagination, Blanche." The problem is that Hauser had been sharing his suspicions with all the lawmen who visited the restaurant. He even told Captain William Baxter of the State Patrol that the car had Oklahoma plates on the car. The final clue came when town druggist in Platte City, not far away, Louis Bernstein, called up law enforcement and said there was a lady in here dressed with tight pants. She looked out of place. She was in here buying medical supplies for Bonnie Parker's burns. And that was the clue. And they started sizing him up for a showdown here. Now, law enforcement back then was heavily outnumbered by the Barrows gang. The Barrows gang had Browning automatic rifles. That's how they got away with killing so many people. Law enforcement had Thompson machine guns, but they were no match for what the gang had. I don't know if there's anything still out here. I'm sure this land's been picked over. I understand that somebody went out here, got all the bricks and sold them as a fundraiser. You were out here 90 years ago. Just the gunfire that would have happened right here. It's just amazing. I'm gonna go over here and show you how this has all changed in the 90 years since this happened. I'm quite certain that they pushed land around to make for this new interchange down here, but yeah, that's basically would have been the route that they took out of here. I believe they went out this way. Red Crown Tavern, Bonnie and Clyde shootout. Now, after the lawmen decided they wanted to take on Bonnie and Clyde, the county prosecutor, David Clevenger, suggested they confer with Jackson County Sheriff Tom Bash in Kansas City. Kansas City had a police department that was more well equipped. They had iron shields, they had machine guns. Kansas City even had an armored car, but it's not the armored car that you would suspect today. Now, today you would have a heavily steeled, reinforced police vehicle that can withstand any kind of gunfire. Back then, it was basically an automobile with some iron sheeting around it. They parked it in front of the garage, tried to prevent the escape of Bonnie and Clyde. That didn't work because when they started blasting away at this vehicle, the guy in the car got hit in the knees. The horn went off for this vehicle, and the rest of the posse took that as a retreat. When the bullets continued firing, the deputy driving it floored it. He got out of there, which enabled Bonnie and Clyde to escape.
Following the shootout, the gang headed to Iowa, with injuries ranging from minor to severe. Clyde was hit, and so was Bonnie, but Buck Barrow sustained a head wound to his temple that would later take his life, and wife Blanche suffered an eye injury when glass in the getaway car shattered from gunfire. She would permanently lose vision in her left eye. 4 days later, the group was camping out in an abandoned amusement park near Dexter, Iowa, when they were discovered and ambushed by another posse. Every member of the gang left the gunfight wounded or dying. Buck Barrow was gravely wounded as authorities grabbed Blanche Barrow, seen here inconsolable after seeing her husband shot multiple times again. Today, a plaque marks the Iowa site where bullets flew in the July 24, 1933 ambush. Although wounded, both Bonnie and Clyde escaped into the brush with Jones and fled the area, courtesy of another car they stole. Bonnie and Clyde carried on as outlaws for another 10 months before finally dying in a hail of bullets in a Louisiana ambush. Buck and Blanche were the only gang members apprehended in Iowa. With an eye patch over her left eye, Blanche Barrow was extradited to Platte County in Missouri on July 25, 1933. She was in emotional turmoil the whole trip, not knowing if Buck would survive his wounds. On July 29th, she received word that Buck Barrow, her husband, had died. During her preliminary hearing on August 5th at the Platte City Courthouse, bail was set at $15,000. Oh, here is the Platte County Courthouse. It is where Blanche Barrow was brought back after the shootout down in Kansas City, Missouri. A couple of days later, they fled the shootout site, and they were brought, well, she was brought here for trial. She was wounded, but this is the place where she stood trial. So there's a marble plaque at the top that indicates this building was built here in 1866, and it lists all the officials that were in charge of the building of it. But interesting that it's still used as a courthouse.
A lot of these old courthouses are put out of commission. Although she had not fired a weapon during the Platte City gunfight, she was charged with assault with intent to kill Sheriff Coffey. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary for women. However, her sentence was commuted and she was released March 23, 1939, having served over 5.5 years. She immediately boarded a train at the Union Station in Kansas City and arrived in Garvin, Oklahoma to care for her father. Her relationship with her mother had quickly deteriorated, eventually leading to a complete break. Blanche only stayed briefly in Oklahoma, then moved to Dallas, Texas in 1939, working various jobs. In 1940, at the age of 29, she married 27-year-old Eddie Fraser. 1 year later, she completed her parole, and she lived out the rest of her life obeying the law. Blanche eventually died of lung cancer the day before Christmas in 1988. She was 77 years old. She was buried in Dallas's Grove Hill Memorial Park as Blanche B. Fraser. Her memoir, My Life with Bonnie and Clyde, was published in 2004. 17-year-old W.D. Jones would later decide he had enough of the blood in hell and parted ways on September 7, 1933. When he was arrested, he claimed he was coerced into Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree.
I have been indicted along with Clyde and Bonnie for the murder of Malcolm Davis, Fort Worth Deputy Sheriff. I was forced along under threats of death with Clyde Barrow through many of his gun battles and saw him kill 5 men. Clyde Barrow never seemed to care for killing anyone. All he thought of was himself. That's the reason I tried to escape.
And received a 15-year sentence, only to spend 6 years behind bars. The latter part of his life was spent as a drug addict. On August 20th, 1974, Jones went with a female friend to a home on Whitty Lane in Houston, Texas, where she thought she would be granted a place to sleep. The friend would not allow her in, and an altercation ensued. At 3:55 a.m., the homeowner shot Jones 3 times with a shotgun in his front yard. The man told police that Jones was a nice person when sober, but that he knew Jones' reputation and was afraid of him. Jones was buried on August 22nd at Brookside Memorial Park in Houston, Texas. So I'm telling my grandkids about Bonnie and Clyde. They know nothing about it. 1930s, they robbed gas stations, they robbed banks, they robbed stores, they robbed funeral homes, getting all kinds of money that they wanted because they didn't want to work for it.
Are they drunk? They're lazy.
Were they drunk?
They are lazy.
You can say they were lazy. They didn't want to work for their money. And they killed a lot of people. I think they killed more than 9 policemen.
Wow, that's terrible. Look at the airplane.
This site is pretty close to the Kansas City airport. In 1945, this Red Crown complex was purchased by former Sheriff Coffey, who operated it successfully until 1950. He went on to be elected as a presiding judge of Platte County in 1956, which today is referred to as county commissioner. He died in 1964 at the age of 72 during his first elected term. Now, also in 1957, there was an accident that knocked down the awning of the cafe and damaged the gas pumps. And 10 years later, a fire started in the kitchen and destroyed most of the tavern. So what was left standing at the site was stripped and carried off by souvenir hounds. So in 1967, when the Hollywood film came out about Bonnie and Clyde, I think it starred Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, renewed interest in the Red Crown Tavern.
This year's Miss Bonnie Parker.
Glad to meet you.
I'm Clyde Barrow.
Clyde.
We rob banks.
Now I have to confess I haven't seen the movie, so I'm assuming that shootout was depicted in that movie. But it created some interest in this. People would come out here prying at bricks. Again, I didn't find any bricks. In April 1934, a month before they were killed, Bonnie and Clyde opened fire on and killed 2 young highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. 5 days later, they murdered the constable and kidnapped the police chief of Miami, Oklahoma. Despite their brutal series of crimes accounting for 13 murders, Bonnie and Clyde had a romanticized following. The glamour of their blood sport came to an abrupt and ugly end with their own demise on a Louisiana roadside on May 23, 1934. The couple was riding in a 1930s Ford stolen from owner Ruth Warren of Topeka, Kansas, when they were ambushed by lawmen who fired 112 rounds into it. The young lovers died instantly. Bonnie was 23, Clyde 25. Understandably, the mother of Bonnie Parker was unwilling to see her daughter buried next to Clyde Barrow. After all, he was the one who led her down the path of destruction. On a number of occasions, Clyde implored Bonnie to leave him and return to the safety of home, but Bonnie chose to be with him despite the danger. She apparently loved the man greatly. Her grave at the Crown Hill Memorial Park in Dallas is a mecca for sightseers and routinely is shouldered in flowers. Clyde is at rest about 6 miles away at the Western Heights Cemetery, also in Dallas. The sole surviving niece of Bonnie Parker is attempting to get her famous aunt exhumed and moved to be by his side. Mrs. Warren made money from showing the death car as a celebrated relic. Because there were so many other Ford shot-up made to look like replicas, it took a while to confirm the authenticity of the actual bullet-riddled car before Prima Donna Resorts shelled out $250,000 for it in 1988. Today you can see the same car on display in Whiskey Pete's Casino in Primm, Nevada.
I know that when they brought the car of Bonnie and Clyde in, with the body still inside, town people came out and they wanted to see the blood and gore. They wanted to see how these two legendary criminals met their demise. And there were a lot of souvenir takers. They were taking pieces of the car. I understand they were trying to take pieces of her dress. And you know, today, those types of mementos are worth a lot of money.
Today, Bonnie and Clyde memorabilia indeed commands high prices among collectors. This small snapshot of Bonnie sold in 2023 for $3,215. This letter written by Clyde to an ex-gang member sold for $23,750 in 2019. This cosmetic case owned by Bonnie sold for $26,950 in 2012. And this Colt .38 revolver, strapped to the inside of her thigh at the time of her death, sold for a whopping $269,500, also in 2012.
So I want to thank you for joining us on our first ever episode shot in the state of Missouri. If you could leave us a comment, that would be appreciated. How many of you can explain to me why Bonnie and Clyde were the folk heroes that they were? They had a lot of people rooting for them, and maybe it's because of the Depression. They were against the capitalists, they were against the business guy, and they applauded people who stood up to that. But can you imagine if everybody did that? I mean, the lawlessness, well, in fact, we see it today in our urban cities. We see how people are just take what they want and end up killing people. Hey, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of History Hunters.